Welcome to For the Record, a podcast from the Delaware State Senate Republican Caucus, hosted by Senator Brian Pettyjohn, Chief of Staff Deanna Killen, and Communications Director Matt Rebel. This is For the Record.
Let's get this party started. We are joined here today by Brian DiSabatino. He is the CEO of EDIS Company and chair of the Delaware Business Roundtable. So
welcome.
Yes,
Thank you.
welcome.
I'm so glad to be here today.
Well, welcome to our podcast.
This is fantastic.
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
Yeah.
The Taj Mahal.
We actually are the envy of some of the other caucuses. You know, they come back and look at the podcast setup we have here, and they're like, "Wow, this is nice."
For a lot of reasons, not just the podcast set.
I love that, man. One little dip, and this guy goes, "Hey, what are you doing?"
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, I have the good fortune, as you mentioned, of being the CEO of EDIS. We're a now fifth-generation family business founded by my great-grandfather and my grandfather and his brothers back in 1908.
Wow.
And I'm the last of the fourth generation, and I'm bringing up
awesome.
the fifth generation. We employ about 100 folks here in Delaware. We've always been Delaware-centric, and we have the great fortune of being able to drive up and down the state and seeing our legacy physically manifest for the betterment of the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you have any children that are going to be taking over for you?
Yeah, I have three wonderful children. My daughter Jacqueline, right now, hopefully right at this moment, is residing in our cost estimating department as a trainee.
Nice.
I've got two boys, Jacob, who's a captain in the United States Army up in New York City at Fort Hamilton up there, and my son Dylan works for an event company called Millennium.
That's
up
awesome.
in New York City. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. So you want to start with some questions? We can start with, you did two recent opinion pieces regarding healthcare, and then of course we also have a lot of questions about the investment agenda that you talked about.
Sure.
Is there any particular one you'd like to start with, or just want us to shoot?
I'd love to start anywhere. I'm really passionate about Delaware, so I think at the core, the two things that you identified are super important to me as a person, as a Delawarean, as a native Delawarean, and as a business owner here in Delaware. And one of those pieces is health. And obviously, I think we're all interested in our own personal health. My good friend Ben DuPont said to me one time, somebody's told him when he was little, if somebody said to you, spend as much money as you want, like it could be $1 gazillion on the car of your dream, pick really wisely, but you only get one your entire life. What would you choose? And then how would you take care of it, knowing that you're not going to get another one? And, a lot of cars race into mine, and you obviously lubricate it all the time, and you'd clean it and all that. And for Ben, it was an analogy to health, and that really, really resonated with me. Years ago, I had the good fortune of, as part of an executive training program, to go down to Dallas, Texas. And I really just thought they were going to teach us about how to read income statements and balance sheets and how to handle litigation and risk mitigation. And the seminar was held at a place called the Cooper Institute. And Dr. Cooper, as I came to understand, was one of the founders of the thing that, I don't even know if they still do aerobics, but in our era, aerobics was a really big deal.
We still do aerobics. They just call it different
They call it something else. CrossFit.
Yeah.
So he spent, and the institute continues to spend a lifetime doing this longitudinal study on health, tracking people and generations and what they're doing and what their health outcomes are. And the experience there really informed me about not only my own health and its importance relative to our business, but the amount of influence we have on our own outcomes. And so sometimes we write things off to, that's just the way I am, or these are my genetics, or this is where I live, or this is my zip code, or whatever. We completely dismiss our ability to change the trajectory of health. And for the Institute, they had me really focus in on two things. One, diabetes, and the other, heart health. And really, it really comes back to diabetes. Like if we can really, really focus in on that one metric, the heart health will follow.
Right.
But it's even better to do it simultaneously. And if we can really influence ourselves and our organizations and the community as a whole, then we can not only change the outcome, the wellness, the mental wellness, the enjoyment that comes along with that, but we're a capitalist society, so let's not forget that we can change the cost structure as well.
Exactly.
And so the pieces that I wrote really speak to that, because I think we spend an inordinate amount of time in policy work talking about how to chase costs through regulation. And I don't think we spend nearly enough, and frankly, I don't know if we spend any time talking about the way to reduce the cost of healthcare is to improve health and health outcomes. And I think we're woefully short of that. So those were the pieces that I wrote.
And you've implemented some of these in your own company and have seen good results.
Yeah, we brought back this concept of trying to get consumerism embedded into our culture. So we did a couple of things. Number one, we took a leap and became semi-self-insured. So we wanted to have skin in the game and put pressure on ourselves to force us to walk the walk. So secondly, we work with a company called Cardiokinetics, and we developed an education program, a wellness program, a point system, and a measurement system. All of those things working together to drive consumerism. So basically, we pay our people to get healthier. We give them a point system to give them rewards if they participate. We lower the cost of their premiums if they elect to participate in the system.
Okay.
And basically what we do is we sit down a couple of times a year and we show them a worksheet about their life. It's completely confidential to them. But we show them all of the things that are inherited and all of the things where they could have influence. And we show them that how they could extend their life expectancy, improve their day-to-day joy, and lower their personal cost. Like, we'd love for them to put all the money they want into their HSA and never have to draw out a dime. So that they're creating a second IRA with this money. And so we sit down with them to educate them that no, 30, 40% of your outcomes are determined by choices you're making. And if you make better choices, the joy in your day is going to be better, and the money in your wallet is going to be greater. And then collectively, it has an effect on the business.
And that's really a healthcare model, not a sick care model that we're seeing really right now.
Yep.
Where we're paying for insurance to help us when we get sick. This is actually investing in somebody's health.
That's right.
So that they're not having to go to the doctor, that they're not a burden to the healthcare system and to, the doctors and the hospitals and the specialists that are out there.
Yeah, and Brian, it really resonates with me, this whole idea with, I think we take for granted that this is the way we are, this is where we live, this is the food streams that are coming at us, and we just give up. And I don't think we do it consciously. I think we do it subconsciously. But all of a sudden, when you're confronted with, oh, I can extend my life, my joy, and my pocketbook another 30 years, let's behave differently.
Yeah.
So, the funny thing is, the very first year we tried to get everybody into it, who participated? All the people that were already healthy. Right. Like all the gym jocks. They were, hey, this is great. But they were already doing it.
Right.
And we were looking at ourselves like, how are we going to coax people across the table to participate in this program that we knew in our hearts that this was going to be so beneficial? So instead of giving them their gift cards, we brought the gift cards to our Christmas party. And we laid them on their plates. And then all of the spouses of the people that didn't participate saw these big gift cards sitting on the other plates, and they wanted to know why they weren't getting them. We discovered as part of this Christmas party experiment that perhaps if we brought the whole family into the discussion, the probability of participation would go up. And so now I believe we have 98% of the company participating.
That's great.
And we've been able to have our own metabolic syndrome rate. And metabolic syndrome being the combination of diabetes and heart health. We'll just oversimplify it there. And the metabolic health is a leading indicator on outcomes. And when we take a look at the national level for the construction industry, we're a third of it.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so the reason that I wrote those articles, there were a couple of reasons. One was to inspire. I want the private and public sector to both take a look at this. A couple of of weeks ago, I brought members of both caucuses, both chambers, hospital institutions, public sector, private sector employees, and I had a roundtable to show our findings. And with no other motivation than to say, there's another way. Because, when we take a look at, as an example, and I do believe that everybody in Dover has the best of intentions and a great heart. So when we look at House Bill 350 or Senate Bill 1, I do believe that every legislator here has the best of intentions. But I don't believe that everyone has the life experience of the entrepreneur and the business owner. Mm-hmm. And by not having that background, I believe that everybody, not everybody, but many people in Dover really believe the pathway to betterment is through regulation and not experimentation. It's through stopping things rather than starting things. Right. And again, I'm not here to overly criticize, but I think that the life experience of the business and the entrepreneur can shed some light to, maybe there's a better way. Maybe there's a different way than the path we're traveling down.
So, I mean, looking at all of that, looking at the healthcare system in Delaware right now, what we're doing, what do you really think is going wrong with healthcare in Delaware, right? Is it primary care? Is it specialty care? Is it, what the employees, what Delawareans are doing, on a day-to-day basis, whether it's their exercise or their diet or things like that?
I really do. I do believe that we've got a massive health problem. Like if we look at, I think SeniorLiving.com did the study. The seniors in Delaware have the worst health record in the country.
Well, really? Is that because we're doing things wrong in Delaware, or are we getting a lot of the retirees from other states that are coming with the problems that they had?
Both. I don't think that we have necessarily a culture that is steeped in health, right? We have healthcare systems, we have healthcare regulations, we have hospitals, we have doctors' networks, we have all the systemic things. But I don't believe that we have a culture that's steeped in health. As much as I disagree with probably the city of Wilmington's approach to fixing access to healthy food by closing convenience stores.
Yeah, I heard that.
Right? It just sends shivers down my spine. But at the same time, I have a tremendous amount of empathy that if there isn't a convenient flow of good, healthy food into those communities, that maybe they're onto something. So I believe that the consumerism, Brian, is the key here. We have got to educate and incentivize the consumer to make better choices. I have to say that the state of Delaware, as an employer, the largest employer in the state, really doesn't lean on consumerism for the state worker. And I understand why. Like the state workers don't make a ton of money, right? And so you want to keep the cost of health care down. But it almost makes better intellectual and economic sense to say, why don't we give them more money so they can spend more money, right? So if we gave, this is not a proposal, and I don't want your listeners to run with this.
What's the fiscal note on that?
Let's just pick a theoretical number, $1,000, right? If we wanted somebody to spend $1,000 of their own money on better health care choices, maybe we give them $1,000.
Right.
Because I believe that the ROI on that $1,000 is going to pay off in multiples. And not just the ROI of getting the cost of health care down because they're going to be making better choices, but the ROI to them, to their own health and to their own joy and satisfaction. But I think out of the goodness of our hearts, we're asking the consumer to do nothing, and we're getting a horrible response.
Right.
And what do you think about the GLP-1 medications that the state was, offering to the state employees? Do you think that's just a Band-Aid? Do you think that's an incentive?
It's hard to argue with the outcomes, right? I mean, here I am out of one side of my mouth arguing against trying to lower the rate of diabetes. So, I mean, that is fantastic and really ought to be something on the list. At the same time, if we don't work on simultaneously the behaviors that surround it, I think we're really missing a big opportunity.
Yeah. I think one of the things I find interesting is Senator Buckson did a resolution last year that was going to basically urge the governor to make it so any SNAP recipient, basically any food that they would get couldn't be junk food, couldn't be sodas, couldn't be candy, basically healthier options. Yeah. That was voted down. But then, again, we have this in the city of Wilmington where they don't want to have any new convenience stores opening because they sell nothing but junk food. So they want to, I feel like it's like wanting to constrain what the consumers are buying, but at the same time, people who are using taxpayer money, and it's needed. I'm not knocking the program itself, but they're allowed to just buy whatever. I think that's kind of ironic.
We send really confusing and mixed signals, and I think that's a really great example. We know that we are flooding these poorer communities with lousy food, right? Yeah. And then we're not willing to do anything about it. And so I think we've got some work to do.
So important with the context, right, that when I introduced that legislation, which was just a directive, a resolution that said, hey, we'd seek a waiver. I was met with, you're being, kind of demeaning to these folks that are in that space. And I argued that the demeaning aspect was convincing yourself that these folks who are in challenged positions don't have the ability to navigate a store and utilize good choices. You're falling on the space that says these folks need calorie-dense foods, not nutritionally dense foods. And I disagree. And I told them that. And then they said, well, most of these folks are working. And I said, that makes it even more credible because for those folks like me and anyone else that's working, and the majority of folks on SNAP you're saying are working, then feel free to use your income in that space to buy whatever it is you want. But when the government is going to provide for you, we're going to expect that these are going to be nutritionally valuable choices for sustenance, which is literally in the bill, the language, right? Because not only are we then doubling down on poor nutritional values, but then we are doubling down on what we're here talking about, which are long-term health outcomes. And when you study the space of folks that are receiving these benefits, they are also at a more exaggerated number, an increased number of folks with prediabetes, types of, indicators, heart disease, all these other types of aspects that we're trying to avoid that the government is paying for later in life.
Yeah, in business, I think we often ask ourselves, well, if you want to see a result, what does it look like, right? So I think we owe it to ourselves as a community, as Delaware, especially within our poor neighborhoods, to ask the question, like if we were to say in California, like what's the Malibu or the beach where they ride the roller skates, if that is the visual concept that you have for like one of the healthiest areas where they're pumping iron on the beach. If Delaware wanted the brand to be the healthiest state in the country, what would it look like? What would have to happen? And so, I would suggest that our schools, there's no question that the education, the only way, let's just say that the barrier to really good healthy foods resides in the neighborhoods. Well, we have kids for 8 hours a day, 9 months a year. Like, why don't we spend 12 years building a culture of absolute phenomenal health, physical health, nutritional health, mental health, spiritual health?
Interesting, another bill that did pass was a DIE bill that we put forth that basically said to the school districts, you're no longer allowed to purchase for breakfast in the schools anything containing red dye, because red dye is the ingredient that you find in most of your nutritionally insignificant foods, Doritos and Gatorades and those things. They were serving those things, the Danishes, the Pop-Tarts, to our children walking through the doors and then expecting a better outcome, not just over time, but in the first period class where they're getting a sugar dump and a crash. So we've gotten rid of that. And what they're saying is, well, these children, they may not want it. Listen, trust me, they will want it. You just got to allow them time to develop that understanding.
Eric, I never had a name for it, but I'm gonna make it up right now. It's the 1998 potato chip revolt at EDIS. This is what happened. We said to ourselves, like we had like Mr. Chip or Mr. Pretzel. There was a service that brought big cans of chips and big cans of pretzels, and with regularity. So we had a culture in our company that just loved when the cans arrived. We had chips and pretzels all the time. And then we looked at ourselves and said, if we're going to have this wellness program, we can't speak with forked tongue. We can't send the mixed signal. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have weekly fresh fruit set up everywhere. But we're not going to any longer give out free potato chips. Well, hence the potato chip revolution. And people thought we were out of our minds. They said, well, this is the sign and signal of a company in decay. Like, first they take our potato chips and then they come after our 401k.
It's amazing.
And I don't think we can I say that because I don't think we can discount people's tradition and visceral attachment to a stream of food, even when it isn't good.
Attachment.
And so we really have to work hard to be authentic, to show, no, we're not. This is not a penalty. So we have to really be worried. We have to be really careful about the penalties and really steeped in the rewards. Like that convenience store movement that happened this week. Like, I wonder if anybody thought, well, then, if not that, then what? And so, okay, let's just agree that let's shutter the doors of those convenience stores, which I don't think is in a market economy is a fair thing. But let's just give it its due for a minute. Then what?
Right.
Then are we willing to give massive tax breaks to the companies that are willing to take the risk to bring in the food products and conveniences that the community should have?
Right.
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 So let's do that. Let's make it, let's have a tax-free zone for grocers in underserved communities.
And then you're going to have the great convenience store revolt of 2026. So then my question to you is, after a year, after 2 years, how did the employees adjust to that? What actually happened? Did they start to enjoy the fresh fruit?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Then
people don't like change.
Then it shifted to the fresh fruit revolt.
Okay.
Right. It was who got more grapes in this department than that. Right. And
rationing of grapes, then,
which is a great problem to have. The rationing of grapes. So the culture began to shift, and because they began to believe the signs and the signals, and the conversations that we were having around health were less awkward and less and more authentic.
Right.
And I have bad news that potato chips do appear from time to time, and especially cookies really do rule the day at Christmas time. But really, we are a culture that at least understands its own personal health and how it affects the greater good of the company.
So you've also been leading the conversation on the economic side of things as chair of the Delaware Business Roundtable. And you said that Delaware is doing some things well, but there are some warning signs ahead. So you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah,
and I want to open this just like the healthcare. I believe that everyone in Legislative Hall has a good heart and really wants to do the right thing. I just think it's unfortunate that not everybody in Leg Hall or the administration have the life experiences that the entrepreneurial piece of the economy has. And I'm not saying that there ought to be this entrepreneurial takeover. No, the legislature should be filled with moms and dads and cops and firefighters and teachers and entrepreneurs. And I think that proportionately the entrepreneur class has been shut out down here. And I think it's time to populate those seats with folks that understand business and understand the brilliant dynamic of the threat of losing your house and the creativity that creates. And so all of that, I say that because it all feeds into this idea of economic development. I have the good fortune of being chairman of the Delaware Business Roundtable. And just as a matter of background, the Roundtable is a collection of CEOs from up and down the state, from every industry and the nonprofit sector. And we see it as our charge to help the public sector understand the signs and signals in the months, weeks, and years ahead of us, as we do in our seats as CEOs. Just think strategically, and then possibly to provide some context and some ideas that might affect us way down the road. And so, as you mentioned, at the roundtable, we see some storm clouds beginning to form, and it hurts our soul. And I say that because we know how great Delaware is. Delaware is a state that has its DNA in being first and being innovative. And really, we go back to the very foundation, where, Caesar Rodney put a scarf on his face and rode his little tail off, to cast that vote. That is the spirit of risk-taking and innovation that has sat in Delaware for 250 years. Not long after him, Mr. DuPont came across from France trying to avoid the French Revolution and was assisted by Thomas Jefferson around the innovation of gunpowder.
Yeah.
And we have an entire economy built on that. And so that very spirit, we believe, is at risk by well-intentioned policy. And this is what it looks like. Well-intentioned policy that takes the form of wanting to help working families by creating the Family Medical Leave Act. And if you are an owner of a business that's had to try to implement the rules and regulations around it, you realize that we didn't get it right. It is not in a good place.
Yes.
It has cost us money, which costs jobs, right? We have had to make decisions between hiring or implementing the state-created system.
Really?
Right? Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. It costs real money. These aren't fictitious dollars. Secondly, it has put a space between us and our employees that we've never had. Right. It's like that idea of somewhere along the healthcare system, there became a separation between you and your doctor. Right? And it became the government. They may not label it that, but there's space, and it didn't always exist. There's now a space between us and our employees where we have to send our employees to the system to go get help. And it's not comfortable for a small family business like ours. So FMLA is an example of that. If you look at what was attempted and will be attempted in rent control,
Yes.
That is a sign and a signal that, oh no, things can go really wrong. We talked about House Bill 350. I don't think that there's one malintent heart down here. I believe that, look, we share everybody's frustration with the cost of health care, but putting a board on top of a board isn't the way to do it. And when we look at the inspirations for the legislation in New England, they're not happy with it either.
Right.
And so the signs and signals that Dover has become disconnected from entrepreneurial-based solutions to get to a better place, that's why I began the discussion with risk-taking and entrepreneurship, I think is missing here. Very few times. And when we look at as an example, the decoupling bill, look, I don't think for a second that the governor had a vicious intent in his mind. He really believed in his heart of heart that we had a financial problem, and we should give him his due for that. But not to really work diligently as a legislature and an administration with the business community to ask the question, is there another way? And to rush that bill through is one small sign and signal, and that is costing us money.
So do you see that more of as a political solution versus a pragmatic solution to the revenue problem?
Yeah, Brian, I don't even want to give it a label. I just believe that it's a decision not informed from a position of understanding of entrepreneurship.
Okay.
Right? And really relying on whether it's education or experience around public policy. For those that seek educations that are theoretical in public policy, that's what you get.
Right.
From those that have experience from the entrepreneurial class, you'd get a different result. And I can tell you that, look, on its surface, it's not going to be catastrophic in a day. Nothing is. But when you add all of these things together, FMLA and decoupling, as an example, have cost us jobs. Yeah. How does decoupling cost us jobs? Our customers are not investing in capital as aggressively as they would have if they were able to take the accelerated deductions. Right? That results for our industry into jobs. Right. Can I point to the job it lost? No. No, let's not be exaggerated or hyperbolic here. But I think we can understand that if our customers aren't investing in capital, it doesn't translate into a job.
Yeah.
Those are signs and signals that we call storm clouds. Yeah.
Yeah, and you had mentioned a couple other storm clouds. I'm just going to read off of one of the slides that you gave during your presentation. You had mentioned the hospital oversight board or board oversight. And just for our listeners who aren't familiar, HB 350 is the bill that established that board that basically oversee costs for the hospitals, rent control, which you just mentioned. And we did a whole episode on the rent control because they had a housing affordability meeting a couple weeks ago. And this was brought up as the solution.
Yeah.
So we talked about that. Not Ready in 6, which is the permit issue, which I do believe Governor Meyer is working on.
I think we're making
now.
great progress on Ready and 6. Very happy. The administration, I think, is doing a great job with Ready and 6.
Yes, I know Senator Hocker is actually working with Representative Bush and the governor's office on putting, and one of his ideas was basically to set up an appeals board through DelDOT for people to go through, kind of similar to like the DENREC appeals board.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had proposed that a little while ago and could get the traction on it.
Yeah.
But
Yes, Senator Hocker actually
who
did
gets
the
the
bill.
credit doesn't matter as long as it's a good idea and it gets through.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Meaning if as long as it's moving forward, it's all good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
Exactly. And then, of course, the rush to decoupling. So, and then you also had mentioned corporate franchise. And if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I don't think we can minimize the fact, and for the average Delawarean, they don't see it every day, right? And the idea of the corporate franchise is foreign to most Delaware families because we don't see it in our lives. We don't see it in an income tax. We don't see it in any form of other revenue. It's almost like this hidden treasure trove that we think that every other state must have. So ours is just like everybody else's. But it's a special feature. In a $7 billion budget, it's a third of the budget. And it's fragile. And I say that because this jewel used to be held by New Jersey.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Just 100 years ago. Right? And because it was neglected, it moved to Delaware. And at this very moment, there are forces around this country that are trying to steal it from Delaware.
Yeah.
And we can argue, as an example, that the Texas court system is new and unproven, but to some people, it doesn't really matter. It's the perception. And look, I give the legislature and the administration big props for passing SB 21, right? It was fantastic, right? But that's part one in a multi-part saga here. Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan was just interviewed, and he said, it wasn't too long ago that I believe the number, I could be off a little bit, that the number of jobs from JP Morgan Chase in New York was somewhere around 35,000. Now it's 25,000. And coincidentally, in Texas, it went from, about 23 to 33,000, right? And to ignore the idea that whether it's tax policy or court systems, companies are seeking the best potential outcome for them and their shareholders.
Right.
As an example, in the state of New Jersey, Exxon, who resided there forever because of its proximity to New York City, but they were domiciled in Jersey. They should have moved their incorporation to Delaware because it's a heck of a lot closer to New York than Texas. But without even considering Delaware, they leapt all the way across the country and moved to Texas.
Right.
And that just shows you how easy it is, with a flick of a switch on a piece of paper in legislation, to raise tax policy or to neglect our corporate franchise without renewing its aggressive nature to protect corporations and its shareholders every year, that we could suffer the same fate.
Right.
So I don't have a script, but I wanted to ask you a question. DFAC and the decision made to remove one of the members, the questions that were asked, were they legitimate questions that we need a real answer to?
Senator, I hope you respect my position here. You know, I'm here as a member of the Delaware Business Roundtable, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on the politics of what's going on in DFAC. But I do think
just curious about the questions.
But DFAC in general is something that we all rely on, and the integrity of DFAC is something that we should hold very, very near and dear to our hearts. It should work as an independent body and be without political influence. Yeah. Because we saw what happened with decoupling, right? And I'll give the administration its due. The administration and the general public and the legislature should all rely on DFAC as being so independent of politics that whatever they say should be felt like it's true.
Yeah. Because my understanding on the questions were something that I raised during the Joint Finance Committee, which was the difference in the type of incorporations that are there. There's a different level there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to understand
tier
better.
Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3.
And that's what was not being clearly presented during JFC when I asked those questions. There is a difference. There's an uptick where maybe there's a greater than, but is it relevant?
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I think one of the most important questions that we should be asking ourselves, and we should be asking the corporate section of the bar, is what's next? What are we doing to double down? Like I don't understand why, if we're getting $2 billion plus a year from the corporate franchise, why aren't we asking the question, why can't it be 3?
Right.
Why do we find ourselves always defending the status quo, which we should, by the way? Why don't we say to ourselves, what's next level? Right? Because if we're going to have a $7+ billion budget, the money's got to come from somewhere. And we can't let that corporate franchise go backwards. We can't.
Right.
We just can't, because it's going to force things that we can't even imagine.
Agreed.
Right?
And is it a matter of codifying some of the decisions that were beneficial that our courts have made so that there's no deviation from there in subsequent rulings? Kind of what some of the things that Texas has done. They've said, okay, let's take the best of what Delaware has decided, not only in the law, but in their decisions. Let's stick it in code so that there's no deviation, and then there's that certainty that businesses are looking for. And when you're looking at when a business is looking where to incorporate, certainty is really up there at the top of the list.
It's everything.
Yeah.
It's speed and certainty and cost.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm the last person that you should be asking for the technical answer to what's next. But I think making sure that the corporate bar, the corporate section of the bar, meets with more frequency and is staying on top of contemporary thought. And we're in a new era of founders. Like we were dealing with, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or X, or Tesla. I think the idea of understanding what is in the mind of a founder, how is that dynamic today different than it was with General Motors over 100 years ago? Like what is that dynamic, and how do we need to make corporate law more contemporary and more predictable, and make it beneficial for the founder to advance their company? I mean, there's a very famous podcast that was given by Mark Zuckerberg. Like, if he hadn't had the latitude as a founder to work around his board of directors a little bit and get aggressive to save his company, there maybe some people would like this, but there wouldn't be a Facebook, there wouldn't be a Meta. And so offering that predictability and flexibility was key. Yeah. Right.
Another thing you highlighted in your presentation was that there's a big portion of the Delaware population that's not in the workforce. So I wanted to ask you why you think that is, and why does it matter?
Yeah, it matters a lot. We need more and broader participation in the workforce. If we just looked at 3 big chunks of the way that $7 billion bureaucracy gets taken care of, we talked about the corporate franchise. Then there's corporate taxes, and then there's personal income tax, right? And so we need more able bodies participating in the workforce to make sure that we don't lose ground in that section of tax as well, without having to raise the taxes, right? So we need more people, and we need them to make better wages. So I think the phenomenon shouldn't surprise us here in Delaware that we are importing older people. Yeah. I think that's really the sum total of it. and they're enjoying the benefits of this state, and we love that, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, it's really made Delaware probably one of the top 5 states in the country for people not participating in the workforce, and that is dangerous. So we really need to think long and hard about how do we attract young founders of new companies? How do we attract young employees? How do we get people at Delaware State University, the University of Delaware, Wilmington University, and Goldie Beacom to really choose Delaware and stay here for the rest of their lives? We really need to broaden that base of young people. You know, Delaware has an interesting problem also statistically. We are suffering from, I think it came out this week, the new unemployment rate in January is 5.4%, up from 5.3%, up from 4.6%.
Yeah.
I don't like the trajectory. Now, I think in the next couple of weeks, a couple of new months, you know, the government shutdown really screwed the BLS up, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I think we're going to see some more data coming out. So let's just keep an eye on that. But what's really important is that the national unemployment rate is steady and declining, and Delaware's is increasing. And when you start to look at some of the things that we talked about, FMLA, minimum wage, you know, the minimum wage, I think, comes from a really great place in people's hearts, right? Who doesn't want that? But then all you have to do is walk around and look at the technology that's replaced the workers that used to make $8 to $10, right? And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, now I understand why regulation is beginning to create unemployment. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to begin to connect those dots, that regulation is having an effect on the employment and the employability of Delawareans.
Yeah, very true. So if Delaware wants to stay competitive, what do you think they need to do?
Oh,
I'm sure there's lots of things.
Oh, we have a blueprint. Yeah, we have a blueprint. So in 2016, we were really grateful to have the roundtable pour its intellectual capacity into something called the Delaware Growth Agenda. And it was a blueprint to help Delaware grow. And they did I say they because I wasn't part of the team in 2016. They did a SWOT analysis, the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and threats for the state. And what they came up with is a number of recommendations. First and foremost, they thought it would be a good idea, this is where decoupling works, to decouple the idea of economic development out of the bowels of the bureaucracy and move it into a public-private partnership that we call the Delaware Prosperity Partnership. As a result of that recommendation, then Governor Carney passed what was called Executive Action Number 1, Executive Order Number 1, to create this Delaware Prosperity Partnership. And the result of it is billions of dollars of capital spending here in Delaware and thousands upon thousands of jobs. It's a public-private partnership where the state puts up a little bit of money, the private sector puts up a little bit of money, the private sector has seats at the decision-making table, the private sector has seats at the table, and now I'm on that board as a member of the round table, and we act as ambassadors for economic development and trying to bring companies in.
And that makes total sense, having all those people at the table together.
Yep. So that was 2016. So fast forward into this election cycle, we thought, you know, the incoming candidates would probably benefit from, we think it's our wisdom and research once again. So we created the process once over again, where we went up and down the state. We interviewed businesses, we interviewed the public sector, we interviewed nonprofits, we interviewed folks from outside the state of Delaware. We compared ourselves to other states and high performance areas. And we came up with something called the Delaware Investment Agenda. Essentially, it's broken into a roadmap of 3 distinct areas. Area number 1 is create job growth, investment in job expansion. Secondly, it's in workforce development. How do we create the best pathway for folks that want a job to get a job? And third, how do we create transparency and planning around all of that?
Right.
So the first area is create more jobs. There's a number of ideas that we have, and some of that I think we're going to be proposing here in the legislature fairly soon. One is inspire the spirit of business founding and entrepreneurship through thoughtful tax policy. You know, we think that if Delaware wants more young people to found businesses here, like they do in California and Palo Alto, then we ought to be working to bring businesses, whether they're coming in from New York City facing those high tax consequences, or the businesses that are fleeing California, those great startups. Let's bring them here to Delaware, and we think we can influence them through good tax policy. Yeah. Another idea that we have is to let's reinvent the way that we approach small business. And again, the Delaware Small Business Office is great, but if you go onto their website, my fear is that if you were a small business, you know what you want first and foremost? Customers, right? Yeah. Our forte in the Delaware Small Business Office really revolves around finance, which is important. And then the level of expertise is a handoff.
Right.
A handoff to other institutions, to chambers of commerce.
Right.
Look, I've talked to so many small businesses that just want a wingman or a wingwoman, somebody to sit by their side. How do I do this? How do I do that? And I have to tell you that our bureaucracy, although well-meaning, isn't steeped in a level of expertise that could take the incubating small business from 0 to 100 very quickly. So Small Business Development Center. A third area is we believe that our systems of higher education are at the precipice of something great. I mean, if we look at the area of we call it tech transfer, and I'll give you a couple of examples. At the University of Delaware, there's a startup company that collaborated with the university, research at the university. A little bit of public funding, not a lot, a little bit of public funding and cooperation from private industry has created a technology at the University of Delaware that's kind of like facial recognition, but it's object recognition. It can do security screening to detect foreign objects that are threatening. You see it at the airports, right?
Yeah.
We see it at ball games, right? They detect these areas of risk, and they relied on the university's researchers to come up with this pathway to technology. And then after it's invented, then the licensing goes out to the company. The revenue streams come into the universities.
Oh, that's good.
Right?
Smart.
It's not a novel idea at the university, right? But we are, I don't believe, are in first place in research and development around the country. Actually, if you look at Delaware's per capita spending on research and development like that, it lags. It's in the bottom quartile in the country. If we're going to create a more robust economy to be able to afford a $7 billion budget, we need to create more companies with more jobs and bring up the wage through that intellectual investment. So there are a lot of great ideas that we have there.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good point, too, because there's a lot of things that have come out of the University of Delaware in the past.
Yeah.
A lot of great inventions.
Oh, my gosh.
That the university's not seeing the revenue from that.
Yeah.
You look at your iPhone.
Yeah.
Even on the Android, the technology's there. But there's
Is that technology?
I don't know. But there's technology in our phones that was developed at the University of Delaware.
Yeah.
But that millions or even billions of dollars that they could have gotten from that it never materialized because of the intellectual property agreements that they had.
Yeah. So I think if we look at both the regulations and the law as well as the state investment, I don't think it takes a lot of additional state investment to get there, but imagine the reward. I mean, again, just imagine if we could create a revenue stream for our universities that would allow the state system to pull back. Like, I'm not suggesting we do that right now, right? I'm a big advocate for state funding of our systems of higher education. But why don't we try to lean more into the free enterprise system to replace the subsidies that are coming from the public sector now?
Yeah.
And I think there's a really, really big opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to shift back over just because this is such an important topic right now. It's at the forefront with SB1. This is kind of back on healthcare. So I just kind of wanted you to just kind of first tell a little bit what SB1 is about, because some of the listeners might not know, and then just what you think. I want to hear your thoughts on the bill.
I'm not an expert in healthcare, and I'm not going to begin to debate or parse SB1. But I think central to the philosophy that we aren't. Let's just decide what the promised land is. The promised land is better health, right, at a much reduced cost and accessible to everyone, right? That's the promised land. I believe that those of us that work in the private sector don't believe for a minute that we're going to get to a promised land that looks like that by more bureaucracy, more regulation, and more taxing. And unless you've lived our life experience, you wouldn't believe that.
Right.
Right? And so I really have empathy for those that don't get it.
Right.
But I do believe we've got to figure out how to use the private sector to unleash some of these results and to inspire us to get to that promised land.
Okay, good. All right. We can also link the Delaware investment agenda that you were talking about earlier. We can also link that to the podcast so people can view that. I think that was very helpful.
Can I ask
appreciate
a question back to that, though?
Yeah.
You're not an expert.
Yeah.
Guess what? The senators, like me, are not experts either, but we're challenged with making that decision. Right. So you really don't have a thought on if you're for. Technically, less regulation makes better sense.
Yes.
SB1 is kind of regulating things more and more. So my thoughts are that I'm not in favor of it. The challenge I had with the committee hearing that I sat on was typically I could, like in 350, HB 350, it became clear to me my challenges with the bill and why I was opposed to it. The problem with SB1 is what I want to do is validate my concerns. And when I sat in that committee, what I saw were very smart people making very good points from both sides. And that was a real challenge for me.
That is challenging.
I don't know if there's a clear validating point to get away from it, to say no to it other than regulation, which is real.
Yeah.
You know?
With my small business hat on, you know, it puzzles us when we look at Dover and see decisions like that made so quickly. These are structural, generational ideas and decisions that are happening down here. Some of them get rushed through emergency sessions.
Yes.
Right?
That happened a lot this year.
And so I think we are doing ourselves a massive disservice when, with all of the best of intentions, our elected officials sit in their caucuses and with lobbyists and with major systems to devise solutions without taking the time to put constituents together to learn more and more and more. You know, I really do believe that if a bunch of small businesses and large businesses, without the hospital systems and without the lobbyists, sat in a room to try to help figure out these problems, you'd come to a different conclusion. But for the sake of efficiency, vote counting, and expediency, I really worry that decisions are rushed down here that have generational and terrible consequential outcomes.
Now let me state for the record, in that space, in my short tenure here, I have become an expert, and you are absolutely right. Things are rushed. Things are moved around here in rooms and free from outside influence, and that's regrettable because it does. The primary premise of HB 350, in my opposition to it, was the rust nature. What I gave them credit for was rather simple. All right, you've sent a shot across the bow. You've brought the players to the table that are saying we are now here willing to work with you to come up with solutions. Let's pause. Let's get them in the room. Let's navigate the system. Let's come back in the next session, post-January, and let's implement some of those changes that are recommended by all. They didn't do that. They rushed it through, and guess what happened? It got blown up.
Yeah.
So you're right.
So let me kind of close with one question for you. So, you know, you something happens and you get picked. You know, Brian, you have control of the executive branch. You can work with the legislative branch and the judicial branch for 90 days.
Yeah.
What would you do to make Delaware significantly better in a 90-day time frame?
I'd begin with helping everybody understand what the vision could look like instead of being caught in the day-to-day.
Right.
And so the vision of Delaware it could be extraordinarily bright. And I say that because the DNA of Delaware is amazing. From agriculture to manufacturing to the trades to the sciences, Delawareans are fantastic. What I worry about is that we are led to a point where we are not reaching our full potential, and we don't even know it. Yeah. So I believe that, number one, that if we look retrospectively, if we had controlled state spending for the past decade to at or below the inflation rate, right, we'd have probably a $100 to $200 million surplus today. Wow. But we've exceeded that. Right. I think if we really look and ask ourselves, how do we grow this economic base by another $100 to $200 million, right? I think I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that it's not unimaginable that we couldn't have a $200 to $300 million a year slush fund by thinking prudently about our budget and expanding the base. Now, with that $200 to $300 million budget, just imagine the internships you could create coming out of our systems of higher education to make those kids sticky here, to make them stay forever, right? Because their employers are excited about them, because they're living in great places up and down the state. Imagine a state where if we had $200 to $300 million extra dollars, we could have the single best apprenticeship program for the trades and the envy of not just in this country, but you know how everybody talks about Sweden having the best apprenticeships? I want the Swedes to come here to see how we do it, right? I want to be that good. That's the kind of vision that if you gave me 90 days, I think we ought to have here in Delaware. And I don't think it's a stretch. We have the assets to do it, but we've self-selected into not an income stream, but an expense stream that prohibits us from making our own choices. The choices are finding us, sadly, instead of us finding the choices. Right. So I think that there needs to be an expansion of our economic base. I think there needs to be prudence amongst the way that we spend our dollars. And I think there has to be real vision of how we would take that excess and invest it so that there's an ROI for our kids. You know, the kids today are in a challenging environment where they are coming out of a system where they are underemployed or unemployed. And I'm more worried about the underemployed because they don't even know it. The wages that they're coming out of these schools with are far below their potential, and they're ending up in the incarceration system at a much higher rate than they ever should be. So spend less money, expand the tax base, and invest it in a future that's beneficial for everybody.
Great. Yeah.
For the Record is recorded and produced by the Delaware State Senate Republican Caucus. You can find us with the DE Senate GOP handle on Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, and Threads. Discover more about our caucus on our website, senategop.delaware.gov.